Carl Jung lived in an age before the term burnout existed. Yet, he recognized it in the faces of the men and women who came to him, worn down not just by their work but by the weight of a society that demanded endless productivity while starving the human soul. To Jung, this exhaustion was spiritual, a collapse that occurred when life became too mechanical, too divorced from the deeper currents of meaning. In his writings and therapy, Jung described what happens when the inner life is neglected. He believed the modern person had grown obsessed with outer achievement, climbing higher, earning more, keeping pace with industry and technology. But behind these triumphs lurked a dangerous shadow. When the psyche is reduced to a tool for output, when imagination and reflection are treated as luxuries, the soul begins to revolt. This revolt, Jung suggested, manifests as fatigue, depression, and a haunting sense of emptiness that many today would recognize as burnout. Unlike Freud, who emphasized childhood conflicts, Jung focused on the cultural and spiritual conditions that shape our lives. He saw the 20th century accelerating into a storm of machines, factories, and mass movements. He was troubled not by technology itself, but by how it disconnected humans from their inner ground. He wrote that modern people had become overwhelmed by their tools, enslaved to progress that promised comfort but delivered restlessness. Even then, Jung noticed the paradox. The more society achieved outwardly, the more individuals felt hollow within. This hollowness, he warned, could not be filled by more work, success, or possessions. That path only deepened the weariness. Burnout, in Jung's view, was not just exhaustion, it was the psyche's protest, a signal that life was drifting too far from its center. He called this center the self, the deeper totality of the personality, and believed everyone had a responsibility to align with it. If ignored, the self forced its presence into awareness through symptoms, anxiety, fatigue, and the sense that one's efforts were meaningless. To Jung, this inner collapse was not a weakness but a message. He urged his patients to treat their exhaustion as a summons to turn inward, to listen to the soul. He saw burnout not as individual failure but as a cultural epidemic, born of an age that worshipped speed and efficiency at the expense of reflection and wholeness. The banker who could no longer face his office, the housewife trapped in endless duties, the soldier broken by mechanized war, all were victims of the same imbalance, a world where the outer mask of productivity had crushed the inner need for meaning. Jung's insight was radical because he insisted the solution lay not in temporary rest or distraction, but in a deeper reorientation of life. Rest was necessary, but only as a doorway. The true task was to rediscover a relationship with symbols, myths, and the unconscious, the sources of renewal that industrial society had dismissed. Without this connection, he warned, exhaustion would return endlessly, regardless of rest or vacation. This is why Jung spoke so often of dreams. He believed they were the hidden medicine for modern fatigue, messages from the unconscious revealing what the conscious mind had neglected. Where society demanded rational planning, dreams brought irrational images. Where the workplace demanded control, dreams offered mystery. To Jung, paying attention to dreams was not indulgence, it was survival. It was how the psyche replenished itself in a draining world. Jung's vision of burnout reached even further. He believed it pointed to the loss of ritual in modern life. He argued ancient societies had ceremonies to mark transitions, spaces for withdrawal, and myths that gave suffering meaning. Modern life stripped these away, leaving people to push forward without pause, without acknowledging their inner thresholds. In this void, exhaustion was inevitable. A culture that does not honor the psyche's need for rhythm, Jung warned, will drive its people into collapse. Yet he also saw in burnout the possibility of transformation. When a person could no longer bear the demands of their outer role, they were forced to ask, who am I beyond my work, my duties, my masks? This painful question opened the door to individuation, the process of aligning with one's true self. What looks like failure or fatigue may be the beginning of a deeper journey. Burnout was not only an end but also a threshold. This perspective makes Jung startlingly relevant today. Long before smartphones and 24-hour connectivity, he grasped the psychological cost of endless demands. He understood that the crisis of exhaustion was not simply about working too hard but about living without balance, myth, or soul. To Jung, burnout was modernity's great warning sign, a symptom that humanity had lost its dialogue with the inner life. He counseled patience. He urged people not to treat exhaustion as a problem to be solved quickly, but as a profound signal of what had gone missing. The cure was not found in rushing back to the treadmill, but in rediscovering the forgotten language of the soul, the silence, the symbols, the stories that restore life to its deeper roots. Jung often described individuation as the great task of a human life. It was not about efficiency, not about performing more, but about becoming whole. And this, he believed, was where modern exhaustion carried a hidden meaning. For when someone reaches the breaking point of burnout, when all the outer roles and expectations finally collapse under their weight, a space opens. Painful though it may be, this collapse strips away illusions. What remains is the raw confrontation with the question of who one truly is. In his clinical work, Jung saw this again and again. The businessman who could no longer bear the grind of endless competition, the young woman whose depression left her unable to keep up appearances, the intellectual whose nervous collapse shattered his pride, each was forced to step out of the old pattern. At first, this was experienced as disaster. But Jung urged them to see it differently. Burnout, he told them, was the psyche's way of withdrawing energy from a false path, a way of refusing to cooperate with a life lived only for external demands. He once remarked that people do not suffer because they work too hard, but because they work without meaning. The human being, he said, cannot live on bread alone, nor on paychecks, nor on social approval. We require connection to what he called the numinous, those moments of contact with mystery that lift life beyond the flat routines of survival. Without this, work becomes sterile, and fatigue grows unbearable. Burnout, then, is the soul's revolt against a life drained of the sacred. For Jung, individuation did not mean rejecting the outer world entirely. One must still work, still live among others, still participate in society. But it meant shifting the center of gravity from outside to inside, from chasing recognition to listening to the unconscious. This was not an escape, but a transformation of orientation. A life lived from the self was not less engaged but more real, more rooted, less likely to be torn apart by exhaustion. The danger, Jung warned, was that modern people often misread the call. Instead of seeing burnout as a summons to inner work, they tried to outrun it. They sought stimulation, distraction, new achievements, hoping that if they just did more, the emptiness would vanish. But this only deepened the crisis. He wrote that what modern humanity needed was not greater speed, but a return to stillness. The fatigue so many carried was not a sign of weakness but a sign of having ignored the inner voice for too long. In his own life, Jung did not escape this confrontation. After his break with Freud, he experienced years of inner turmoil that nearly overwhelmed him. He described this time as being abandoned by the spirit of the times, and forced into a confrontation with the depths of his own unconscious. What sustained him was not more work or more outward accomplishment, but his descent into imagination, his dreams, his visions, his dialogues with the inner figures that emerged. Out of this period, he developed his most profound insights, and he later reflected that it was precisely in this collapse that his real life began. This autobiographical truth gave weight to his counsel. Jung was not simply a theorist but a man who had walked through the darkness of inner exhaustion. He knew how terrifying it was to lose the scaffolding of outer certainty. He knew how burnout stripped a person of their familiar identity. And yet he insisted, if one listens, if one allows the psyche to speak, what looks like ruin can become revelation. This is why he valued symbols so deeply. For in moments of collapse, reason often fails. Logical explanations cannot soothe the soul's fatigue. But a symbol, whether in a dream, a myth, or an image, speaks directly to the depths. It offers orientation when the conscious mind is lost. Jung saw in these symbols the seeds of renewal, tiny sparks of the self reaching into awareness, guiding the exhausted individual back toward meaning. Individuation, then, was not a grand achievement to be earned after success, but something born precisely in the midst of breakdown. Burnout was one of its gateways. A person who had been living only as a mask, an efficient worker, a loyal role player, was forced to shed that mask. The energy withdrawn from false life could then be reinvested in a truer one. This reinvestment was slow, fragile, and required patience. But it was, in Jung's view, the only path toward wholeness. Thus, when Jung spoke of the modern crisis, he did not see it as merely unfortunate. He saw it as a historical necessity. The rise of burnout in industrial society was the psyche's way of demanding a new balance, not just for individuals but for the culture as a whole. A civilization obsessed with progress had to be reminded of the inner world it had forgotten. The exhaustion of its citizens was not a side effect but a message, a collective symptom pointing toward the need for renewal. To recognize this is to shift the meaning of our suffering. Burnout is no longer only a private misfortune. It is the voice of the unconscious calling us to recenter, to ask deeper questions, to step out of the machinery of endless demands and reclaim the path of individuation. And though the journey is painful, Jung believed it was also the path to healing, not just for individuals, but for an entire age. Jung's exploration of burnout could never be separated from his understanding of archetypes. For him, exhaustion was not merely a matter of overwork, it was a sign that the fundamental energies of the psyche, the archetypal forces that move beneath consciousness, were being neglected or distorted. When a life is lived without contact with these deep patterns, the result is a draining disconnection. A person works harder and harder, yet feels emptier with each effort. Archetypes, in Jung's view, were not abstract theories. They were living patterns within the unconscious that gave shape to human existence. The archetype of the mother, for example, spoke to our need for nurture and belonging, the hero to our drive toward struggle and transformation, the wise old man to our longing for guidance. These patterns appeared in myths, dreams, and symbols across cultures. And Jung observed that when they were ignored, their energy did not simply vanish, it turned against the individual, often in the form of fatigue, anxiety, or collapse. Burnout, then, could be seen as a rebellion of the archetypal world. A man who identified only with the hero, striving, conquering, pushing beyond his limits, eventually found himself broken, not because he lacked strength, but because he refused to listen to the archetype of the healer or the lover, the parts of himself that demanded rest, renewal, and connection. A woman who lived only through the archetype of the caregiver, giving endlessly to others, could fall into despair if she neglected the call of her own inner self. Jung warned that when life becomes one-sided, when a person sacrifices the fullness of their psyche for a single role, exhaustion is inevitable. In this sense, burnout was not simply a warning, it was an archetypal correction. It forced a confrontation with the neglected parts of the psyche. The hero was reminded that he could not conquer everything. The caregiver was reminded that she, too, needed care. The archetypes demanded balance, and when denied, they expressed themselves through collapse. Jung often said that neurosis, what we today might call depression or burnout, was the result of a split in the psyche, a failure to integrate the totality of one's inner life. He saw this most vividly in dreams. A patient might come to him exhausted, unable to work, and in their dreams would appear images of water, forests, or ancient figures. To Jung, these were not meaningless fantasies but urgent messages. Water, for example, often symbolized the need to return to the unconscious, to let go of rigid control and allow life to flow again. A wise old figure appearing in dreams could symbolize the archetype of inner guidance, offering the exhausted individual a path forward. Where the modern mind dismissed such dreams as nonsense, Jung insisted they carried the medicine for burnout. But Jung's insight went further still. He believed that entire cultures could fall into archetypal imbalance. The modern West, in his eyes, had become enslaved to the archetype of the hero, the endless drive for progress, conquest, and productivity. This heroic one-sidedness produced dazzling achievements, but also left the collective psyche deeply weary. The archetype of the sage, with its wisdom of reflection, was neglected. The archetype of the child, with its playfulness and renewal, was forgotten. In such a culture, burnout was not just an individual malady but a collective symptom of imbalance. And here lay one of Jung's most haunting warnings. If the archetypal energies of the psyche are ignored for too long, they do not merely fade away. They erupt. He saw in the wars and political upheavals of the 20th century the destructive return of neglected archetypes. When people failed to honor the inner figures of myth and dream, those figures returned on a massive, destructive scale in the form of ideologies, fanaticism, and violence. Burnout, in this sense, was the gentler warning, the early signal that something was deeply out of harmony. Thus, Jung urged his patients, and in a sense, the modern world, to make room for these neglected energies before they erupted uncontrollably. To take dreams seriously, to honor the imagination, to make space for ritual and reflection, was not a luxury but a necessity. Without such attention, the psyche forced its demands to exhaustion, stripping away the ability to function until one could no longer ignore the inner world. What strikes us today is how precisely Jung foresaw the psychological landscape of our own age. In a world that demands constant achievement, the archetype of the hero dominates our culture more than ever. Social media rewards conquest and comparison. Workplaces celebrate relentless drive. And yet beneath it all, millions collapse into burnout, their souls crying out for the archetypes that have been cast aside: the dreamer, the healer, the child, the wise guide. Jung would not have been surprised. He saw it coming long before we gave it a name. For him, the path forward was never about rejecting the outer world. It was about integrating it with the inner. The hero must learn humility before the sage. The caregiver must learn to receive from the inner mother. The exhausted person, in reconnecting with these archetypal forces, finds not just relief from fatigue but a deeper alignment with the fullness of life. Burnout, then, was not simply a collapse but an invitation to reintegrate the forgotten archetypes, to honor the wholeness of the psyche, and to step out of the narrow mask of one-sided living. Jung believed that if individuals, and cultures, could heed this call, exhaustion would no longer be the end of the story but the beginning of a more balanced, more human existence. Jung's vision of burnout was inseparable from his reflections on modern speed and technology. Even in his own lifetime, long before smartphones and digital screens, he saw how the accelerating tempo of life was damaging the psyche. He warned that humanity was moving too fast, creating a world in which silence had all but disappeared. Without silence, there could be no dialogue with the unconscious, and without that dialogue, there could be no renewal. He often spoke of what he called the spirit of the times, the dominant mindset of an age. In his era, this spirit was characterized by rationalism, efficiency, and faith in progress. He did not deny the brilliance of these achievements, but he feared what they cost. The spirit of the times had drowned out what he called the spirit of the depths, that ancient, timeless layer of the psyche that speaks through dreams, symbols, and myths. When people gave themselves entirely to the demands of progress, they silenced the depths. And it was from these depths, Jung insisted, that true vitality came. Burnout was the price of forgetting this balance. Jung understood technology as a double-edged force. It could liberate, but it could also enslave. Machines, he wrote, were wonderful servants but dangerous masters. The danger lay not in the tools themselves, but in the way they seduced humanity into constant motion, constant striving, constant distraction. If the machine was allowed to dictate the rhythm of life, the human psyche suffered. People became like their tools, efficient, precise, productive, but drained of mystery, of depth, of soul. Exhaustion was not an accident of modernity but its inevitable consequence when technology replaced silence and ritual. He worried, too, about the fragmentation of attention. Long before social media, Jung noted how modern people could no longer concentrate inwardly. Their minds were scattered across endless duties, schedules, and noise. He believed the psyche required intervals of stillness, like the fallow season of the earth, to replenish itself. Without this, the unconscious could not speak. Dreams dried up, imagination withered, and life became a flat routine. Burnout, he said, was what happened when the soil of the psyche was never allowed to rest. Jung himself practiced what he advised. He often retreated to his tower at Balingen, a stone house he built by hand on the shores of Lake Zurich. There, without electricity or modern distractions, he lived in a rhythm closer to the natural world. He carved stones, tended a garden, sat in silence by the water. It was not escapism. It was medicine. Balingen gave him the silence to hear the depths of his own psyche, to remain rooted in symbols rather than consumed by noise. For him, this was essential not only to his own sanity but to his ability to guide others. He believed that every person needed some form of this silence, some refuge where the unconscious could be heard. Looking at our present age, it is easy to see how his warnings have only intensified. The spirit of speed has multiplied beyond anything Jung could have imagined. Smartphones, emails, algorithms, tools designed to capture attention without pause, have created a world in which silence has nearly vanished. The psyche, unable to rest, revolts in the only way it can, through exhaustion, anxiety, and collapse. Burnout is not a sign that something is wrong with the individual. It is a sign that something is wrong with the culture. Jung would likely remind us that this collapse carries meaning. He would tell us that when our devices leave us hollow, when our endless striving leaves us numb, we are being forced to confront the fact that no machine, no productivity system, no outward success can replace the nourishment of the soul. He would insist that we must carve out spaces of stillness, whether in nature, in art, in ritual, or in simple silence. Only in such spaces can the unconscious renew us. Without them, burnout becomes the defining illness of the age. For Jung, then, technology was not to be rejected, but balanced. The machine could serve us only if we remembered that we are not machines ourselves. We are beings with an inner life that demands rhythm, mystery, and depth. To ignore this truth is to invite collapse. To honor it is to rediscover what it means to be fully human. This was perhaps Jung's deepest warning about modern burnout, that it is not only a psychological crisis, but a spiritual one. It reveals the cost of living entirely in the spirit of the times, cut off from the depths. And it invites us back, not backward into nostalgia, but downward into silence, into imagination, into the forgotten roots of the soul. For Jung, burnout was never the end of the story. He saw in it the threshold of something greater, the possibility of transformation, not only for the individual but for the entire culture. Collapse, in his philosophy, was not meaningless suffering. It was a demand from the unconscious, a summons to turn toward what had been neglected. The exhaustion so many feel today, the hollowness beneath constant striving, is not a private misfortune alone. It is a message whispered through millions of lives, telling us that we cannot continue in this way. He believed that humanity was always in dialogue with itself, consciously and unconsciously, and that when the conscious path became too narrow, the unconscious broke through. Burnout was one form of this breakthrough. It stripped people of the illusion that they could live only for external roles, worker, achiever, provider, performer, and forced them to ask, what lies beneath these masks? What is the deeper pattern of my life? What is the self asking of me? These questions, though painful, opened the way to individuation. Individuation, for Jung, was never selfish. It was not about withdrawing into isolation or rejecting the world. It was about living from a center that could carry the weight of both outer duties and inner truth. A person who had passed through burnout and listened to its message could return to life renewed, able to give without collapse, to work without emptiness, to engage without losing themselves. In this way, burnout became not just a warning, but an initiation. Jung often warned that if individuals ignored these initiations, the consequences would grow larger. The psyche does not forget what has been neglected. It forces recognition, whether through illness, breakdown, or collective crisis. Yet he also held hope that if people listened, if they honored silence, dreams, symbols, and the deeper rhythms of the soul, then burnout could mark the beginning of a new relationship between the individual and the culture. The very illness of the age could become its teacher. What makes Jung's insights so haunting today is how clearly they anticipate our own world. He foresaw the weariness of lives consumed by machines, the fragmentation of attention, the emptiness of constant striving. And he foresaw the danger of ignoring the inner life until it revolts. Yet he also offered a path, to see exhaustion not as failure, but as a summons. To step out of the cycle of endless productivity and return to what gives life depth, silence, imagination, myth, nature, and the symbols that connect us to the self. In this light, modern burnout becomes something more than a personal burden. It is a sign of our age's imbalance, but also a doorway. Each person who heeds its call and begins the slow, difficult journey inward becomes part of a larger healing. The culture that drives people into collapse is the same culture that can be renewed, if enough individuals remember that we are more than machines, more than workers, more than masks. Carl Jung did not give us easy answers. He never offered quick fixes. What he gave was something more demanding and more profound, a reminder that the soul has its own laws, and that to ignore them is to suffer. But to honor them is to rediscover life itself. Burnout, he warned, is the price of forgetting the self. Yet in remembering it, in turning inward and finding balance again, we do not merely recover our strength, we recover our humanity. And perhaps that is why Jung's warning still matters. For in an age of exhaustion, his voice calls us back to what cannot be measured, cannot be hurried, cannot be replaced. It calls us back to the silence beneath the noise, to the depths beneath the surface, to the soul that waits patiently, even now, for us to return.